I'm Evelyn Chen, 67, and I've spent every New Year's Eve for the past 20 years cooking a feast that would make my ancestors proud. This year, I planned for weeks hand-rolled dumplings, slow-braised short ribs, homemade noodles, dishes that took 20 hours of love and preparation. When my family walked in and saw my spread, my daughter Jessica laughed and said, "Oh, we already ordered pizza. We figured you'd make something simple." As I watched them devour greasy slices, while my masterpiece sat untouched, something inside me finally snapped. What I served them next wasn't on any menu. It was 20 years of swallowed pride, dismissed effort, and the truth about how they really saw me. By midnight, everything had changed. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, like this video. This story is about finding your voice when you've been silent too long. I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the feast that had consumed my entire week. 20 hours of preparation, and for what? The silence felt heavier than the cast iron pot still warm on the stove. My grandmother's cleaver lay on the cutting board, its carbon steel blade darkened by decades of use. She'd brought it from Guangzhou in 1952, and it had never failed to slice through the toughest meat, the most stubborn vegetables. Tonight, it seemed to mock me, all that precision, all that tradition, reduced to nothing. The dumplings sat perfectly pleated in bamboo steamers, each one a small work of art. I'd rolled the wrappers by hand, just as my mother taught me, just as her mother taught her. The filling was a symphony of pork and chives, seasoned with white pepper and a touch of sesame oil. 47 dumplings, each one folded with the same care I'd shown my children when they were small. The short ribs had braised for 8 hours in a sauce that took 3 generations to perfect. Soy sauce, rock sugar, star anise, and a secret ingredient my grandmother whispered to me on her deathbed: a tablespoon of black vinegar from Zhejiang. The meat would fall apart at the touch of chopsticks, rich and complex and utterly wasted. My homemade noodles hung like silk ribbons, rolled and cut by hand. The dough had rested for 2 hours, kneaded until it was smooth as a baby's cheek. I'd planned to toss them with scallions and a light soy-based sauce, simple but elegant. Instead, they'd dry out overnight, becoming tomorrow's garbage. The pizza boxes scattered across my dining table looked like cardboard tombstones. Tony's Pizza Palace in garish red letters, grease stains already seeping through the bottom. $26 for what they called a family feast. I'd spent $200 on ingredients alone, not counting the hours, the love, the heritage baked into every dish. My feet ached from standing all day. My back screamed from hunching over the stove. My hands were raw from the heat and the endless chopping, but none of that compared to the ache in my chest. 20 years of this, 20 years of pouring my soul into food that fed bodies, but apparently meant nothing to hearts. I picked up the cleaver, feeling its familiar weight. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. "Ah, Po, in the kitchen, a woman has power. She feeds her family, she keeps the culture alive. But if they don't respect the food, they don't respect you." I'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. I'd become so focused on giving that I'd forgotten to demand anything in return. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room. They were so content, so satisfied with their processed cheese and factory-made dough. When had I become so invisible that my 20 hours of labor could be dismissed with a casual laugh? When had I become so unimportant that my contribution to our family tradition could be replaced by a phone call to Tony's Pizza Palace? I set the cleaver down with deliberate care. My hands were steady now, my breathing controlled. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't thinking about what I needed to do for them. I was thinking about what I needed to do for me. The kitchen had always been my domain, my sanctuary. Tonight, it would become my war room. Enough was enough. I pulled out the wooden recipe box from the cabinet above the refrigerator, its lacquered surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, faded recipe cards bore my mother's careful handwriting, in Chinese characters, some edges stained with soy sauce, others yellowed with age. These cards were my inheritance, more valuable than any jewelry or money she could have left me. The first New Year's Eve after my husband died, I'd stood in this same kitchen, grief-stricken and lost. The children, Jessica was 32 then, Michael 28, had suggested ordering takeout. "Ma, don't worry about cooking. You've been through enough. Jessica had said, her voice gentle but dismissive. Even then, even in kindness, the message was clear. Your effort isn't necessary, but I'd cooked anyway. I'd needed to feel connected to something larger than my grief, to honor the traditions that had survived wars and famines and ocean crossings. That first feast had been my lifeline, a way to keep my husband's memory alive, to maintain the thread that connected us to our ancestors. The family had been impressed that first year. They'd praised the food, asked for recipes, promised to learn. I'd felt useful again, important. I'd thought I was rebuilding something precious from the ashes of my widowhood. How naive I'd been. Year 2. They arrived late because Jessica had a work call. The food was cold by the time they sat down, but they ate with enthusiasm, or at least, politeness. I told myself it was still meaningful, still special. Year 3, Michael brought his new girlfriend, Amy, who was lactose intolerant and couldn't eat half the dishes. I'd spent 3 days preparing, and she nibbled at rice and vegetables, while everyone else ate. I should have felt annoyed, but instead I felt guilty for not asking about dietary restrictions. Year 4, Jessica's first child, Emma, was a toddler who screamed through dinner and threw dumplings on the floor. Mom, next time, maybe we should just do something simple, Jessica suggested as she cleaned pureed sweet and sour pork from her daughter's hair. I'd nodded and smiled, already planning next year's menu. Year 5. They came straight from another party, already full. They picked at my food like polite strangers, talking about people I'd never met, places I'd never been. I'd become background noise in my own home. By year 10, the pattern was established. I'd cook for days. They'd arrive with distractions and full stomachs and half-hearted appreciation. I'd clean up alone while they watched the ball drop on television. I'd lie in bed afterward, exhausted and empty, wondering why I kept doing this to myself. My husband's voice whispered in my memory, "Evelyn, you're the strongest woman I know. Don't let anyone make you forget that." He'd said it during our early years in America, when we were both working 16-hour days, when his family still called me that Chinese girl behind my back, when we were building something from nothing. I'd been strong then. I'd been formidable. When had I become this person, this woman who cooked elaborate meals for people who'd rather eat pizza, this mother who gave and gave and gave without ever asking for anything in return? The recipe cards blurred as tears filled my eyes. My mother had been dead for 15 years, but her careful instructions remained. Add ginger to cut the fish. Cornstarch must be mixed with cold water, never hot. Patience is the most important ingredient. But the most important lesson she'd taught me wasn't written on any card. It was something she'd lived. A woman who doesn't know her worth will never receive it from others. I'd forgotten my worth. I'd let myself become the family servant, the predictable presence who could be counted on to provide but never acknowledged. For providing, I'd confused love with servitude, generosity with doormat behavior. 20 years of diminishing returns. 20 years of watching my heritage get reduced to ethnic food that was interesting but not essential. 20 years of watching my grandchildren grow up thinking their Chinese grandmother was just a nice old lady who happened to cook, not the keeper of centuries of culture and tradition. I closed the recipe box and held it against my chest. My mother's wisdom, my grandmother's techniques, my great-grandmother's stories, all of it lived in these cards, in these hands, in this kitchen. I wasn't just a cook. I was a cultural bridge, a living library, a repository of knowledge that would die with me if I didn't pass it on. But first, I had to reclaim my power. I had to remind them and myself that I was more than a convenience, more than a tradition they could take or leave. I was the matriarch of this family, and it was time I started acting like it. The clock on the microwave read 11:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, it would be a new year. In 15 minutes, I would stop being the woman who accepted crumbs and start being the woman who demanded respect. My husband had been right. I was strong. I'd just forgotten how to show it. The front door opened with Jessica's familiar, authoritative stride. Even at 47, she moved through the world like she owned it, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Her husband David followed, already looking at his phone, and behind them came the teenagers Emma, now 16 and looking bored, and Jake, 14 and sullen. "Sorry we're late, Mom," Jessica called out, not sounding sorry at all. David had to take a conference call with Hong Kong. You know how it is with international business. I knew how it was, actually. I'd spent 30 years married to a man who'd built his import business from nothing. who'd taken those same calls, who'd made those same sacrifices. The difference was that my husband had never used his success as an excuse to dismiss other people's efforts. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, her perfectly styled hair and designer dress making her look like she belonged in a magazine rather than a family gathering. Her eyes swept over my feast with the same expression she might use for a child's finger painting, affectionate but ultimately dismissive. "Oh, Mom, this looks lovely, but we stopped at Romano's for appetizers because we were running late," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, concerned but condescending, like she was talking to an elderly aunt who'd gotten confused about the dinner arrangements. And then David thought it would be easier to just grab some pizza for everyone. "You know how the kids are with traditional food." She gestured toward the pizza boxes that David was already setting up on the dining room table. "We got extra cheese for the kids and that white sauce one you like. Though honestly, Mom, you really didn't need to go to all this trouble. We could have just ordered Chinese takeout if you wanted something ethnic." 20 hours of hand-rolled dumplings, of carefully braised meat, of recipes passed down through 4 generations, reduced to something ethnic, like my heritage was a theme restaurant option. "Actually," Jessica continued, pulling out her phone, "this works out perfectly. I need to document this for my Instagram story. Family traditions, meeting modern convenience, or something like that. My followers love this kind of authentic cultural content." Authentic cultural content. She wanted to photograph my food for social media points while her family ate pizza. The irony was so sharp it could have cut vegetables. Emma wandered into the kitchen, her face buried in her phone. "Grandma, do you have any of those little Coke bottles? The glass ones? They're so aesthetic for photos." She looked up briefly, noticed the food, and wrinkled her nose. "Oh, you made the weird stuff again. Mom, can we just eat the pizza? I'm not really hungry for heavy food right now." Jake appeared behind his sister, gaming headphones around his neck. "Yeah, and I'm supposed to be online with my friends at midnight. This is taking forever." I watched them swarm around the pizza boxes like seagulls around a garbage can. David was already serving himself, talking loudly about some business deal, while grease dripped onto my good tablecloth. Jessica was rearranging pizza slices for better lighting, her phone camera capturing what she would later present as family time. 20 years of this. 20 years of watching my culture get reduced to a backdrop for their convenience. 20 years of being the supporting character in my own story. But something was different this year. Maybe it was the way Jessica hadn't even looked at my food before dismissing it. Maybe it was the casual way she'd called 20 hours of work trouble. Maybe it was watching my grandchildren treat their heritage like an inconvenience. Or maybe it was the way she'd hung her Harvard diploma in my living room 10 years ago, right where my husband's business award used to sit. "For inspiration, Mom," she'd said. "So you can remember what hard work looks like." I'd let her hang it. I'd even dusted it weekly, this symbol of her success that had somehow become more important than the 40 years of hard work that had paid for it. I stood in my kitchen doorway, watching my family devour their pizza and ignore my feast, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, but it was transforming into something else, something harder, something that had been building for 20 years and was finally ready to emerge. Jessica looked up from her phone and noticed me watching. "Mom, you're not eating. Come get some pizza before it gets cold. You can heat up your food tomorrow for lunch or something." Heat up my food tomorrow for lunch. Like it was leftovers. Like it was an afterthought. I smiled at her. The same smile I'd been giving her for 47 years. But this time, behind that smile, I was making calculations. This time, I was planning. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice as gentle as always. "I'll be right there." But I wasn't thinking about pizza. I was thinking about power. I was thinking about respect. I was thinking about what happened when a woman who'd been invisible for 20 years finally decided to be seen. Midnight was coming, and with it, the reckoning I should have delivered years ago. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, as he always did, quietly, without fanfare, carrying a small gift bag and wearing the same apologetic expression he'd worn since childhood. 43. He still moved through the world like he was asking permission to take up space. "Sorry I'm late, Ma," he said, kissing my cheek. Traffic was crazy coming from the city. Unlike his sister, Michael paused at the kitchen entrance. His eyes took in the feast I'd prepared, and I saw something that had been missing from every other face tonight: recognition. not just of the food, but of the work behind it. Ma, this is incredible, he said, his voice carrying genuine awe. You made all of this today. Yesterday and today, I corrected. 20 hours, his face tightened. 20 hours, for he looked toward the dining room, where the sounds of pizza consumption continued. They ordered pizza. I nodded, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. Michael had always been the sensitive one, the child who noticed things others missed. As a boy, he'd been the one to thank me for dinner every night, to ask about my day, to sit with me in the kitchen while I cooked. Jessica had been too busy achieving, too focused on her next goal to notice the woman making her success possible. Jesus, Ma. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his troubled teenage years. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize for them, I said. You're not responsible for their choices. But even as I said it, I knew he'd been part of the problem too. Not through malice, but through silence. For 20 years, he'd watched his sister dismiss me, watched his niece and nephew treat their heritage like an inconvenience, watched his family take me for granted, and he'd said nothing. Michael picked up one of my dumplings, examining it with the reverence it deserved. These are perfect. Look at these pleats. Remember when you tried to teach me to make these? I did remember. He'd been 12, homesick from school, and I'd let him help with dinner preparations. His dumplings had been lopsided and misshapen, but he'd been so proud of them. Jessica had made fun of him for playing with food when she came home from debate practice. You were a good student, I said. You just needed more practice. I should have asked for more lessons. He bit into the dumpling, and I watched his expression change. God, this is amazing. This is exactly how I remember Grandma's tasting. Same recipe, same love, he added, and something in my chest loosened. He walked to the dining room, carrying his plate of dumplings. I followed, curious to see what would happen when he encountered the pizza party. Hey everyone, he said, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. Has anyone tried Ma's food? It's incredible. Emma looked up from her phone. Oh, Uncle Mike, you don't have to be polite. We know it's weird. Weird. The word came out sharper than I'd expected. What's weird about it? You know, Emma said, her teenager's confidence faltering slightly. It's just so, much. Like, who has time to make all that from scratch? It's 2024. Grandma, there's DoorDash. Emma, Jessica said, but her tone was more warning than correction. Don't be rude. I'm not being rude, Emma protested. I'm just saying it's not practical. Like Mom posts about work-life balance all the time. This is the opposite of that. Michael set his plate down with more force than necessary. You know what's not practical? Dismissing someone's heritage because it's inconvenient for your social media schedule. The room went quiet. Jessica's head snapped up from her phone. Michael, what's that supposed to mean? It means, he said, his voice gaining strength, that Ma spent 20 hours making food that represents 4 generations of our family's history. And you replaced it with pizza because it was easier. I didn't replace anything, Jessica said, her voice taking on the defensive edge she'd perfected in courtrooms. I supplemented. I made sure everyone had something to eat. Everyone had something to eat, Michael repeated. Ma made enough food for 20 people. We're 7. The kids don't like Chinese food, David said from behind a slice of pizza. You know how it is. No, I don't know how it is, Michael shot back. I know how it became this way. I know that we stopped expecting them to try new things, stopped teaching them about where they come from, stopped caring about anything that wasn't immediately gratifying. Jake pulled off his headphones. Why are you guys fighting about food? It's just dinner. It's not just dinner, Michael said, and I felt tears prick my eyes. It's culture. It's history. It's your grandmother showing love in the only way she knows how, and it's us being too selfish to notice. Jessica stood up, her lawyer instincts kicking in. That's not fair, Michael. I show appreciation from Mom all the time. I take her to her doctor's appointments. I help with her taxes. You manage her, Michael interrupted. You don't see her. The truth of it hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. David had stopped eating. Even the teenagers were paying attention now. I looked at Michael really, looked at him and saw something I'd been missing for years. His tarnished soccer trophy sat on the bookshelf, a reminder of all the times he'd come in second, all the times he'd been overlooked. But tonight, finally, he wasn't staying quiet. Tonight, he was standing up, Not just for me. For us. For the family we used to be before success and convenience and social media had made us strangers sharing the same name. Ma, he said, turning to me, I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. I should have stood up for you, for this, for what it means. I reached out and touched his hand. You're standing up now, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel completely alone in my own home. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with my grandmother's cleaver. But Emma and Jake seemed oblivious to it. They'd returned to their phones. The brief moment of adult attention, already forgotten. I watched them swipe and tap, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens, and realized I was looking at the future of my family's culture indifferent, distracted, disappearing. Can we just eat? Jake mumbled, not looking up from his game. This is so awkward. Yeah, Emma agreed, holding up her phone. And I need to get some content for my story. Grandma, can you come stand by your food? I want to do a boomerang of you with all the dishes. My followers are going to love this authentic Asian grandmother aesthetic. Aesthetic, my heritage reduced to a filter for social media. My 20 hours of work turned into content for strangers on the internet. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Of course, dear, I said, moving toward the kitchen. Let me just get cleaned up first. As I walked away, I heard Emma talking to her phone. Okay guys, so we're at my Chinese grandmother's house, and she made all this traditional food, but honestly, it's kind of intense. Like who has time for all this, when you can just order Panda Express? You know, Panda Express. 70 years of preserving my mother's recipes, my grandmother's techniques, my great-grandmother's stories, and my granddaughter thought it was equivalent to mall food court Chinese-American fusion. I paused in the kitchen doorway, listening to Jake's commentary. Yeah, it's like, we get it. You're proud of being Chinese or whatever. But, we're American. We don't need to eat weird stuff to prove anything. Weird stuff. The dumplings that had sustained my family through famines. The braised short ribs that had been my husband's favorite comfort food when he was homesick. The hand-pulled noodles that connected us to centuries of tradition. All of it dismissed as weird stuff by children who carried my blood but had never been taught to value what came with it. I pulled out my phone. Even 67-year-old Chinese grandmothers had smartphones and opened the camera app. But instead of taking pictures of my food, I started recording. I wanted to capture this moment, this perfect encapsulation of what my family had become. So this is what happens, I said quietly into the camera. When you spend 20 hours making food that represents 4 generations of your family's history, and your grandchildren call it weird stuff while eating pizza. I panned the camera across my untouched feast, then toward the dining room, where they were all gathered around the pizza boxes like it was a religious ceremony. The contrast was stark. My carefully prepared dishes, sitting in respectful silence while processed cheese and factory-made dough received all the attention. They call it aesthetic, I continued, my voice steady, despite the anger building in my chest. They want to photograph it for social media, but they don't want to understand it. They want to use it as a prop for their authentic Asian grandmother content, but they don't want to be authentic themselves. The recording captured everything, the elaborate spread of traditional dishes, the casual dismissal, the disconnect between effort and appreciation. It was evidence of something I'd been too hurt to see clearly before. I wasn't just being taken for granted. I was being erased. My culture, my contributions, my very identity as the family matriarch had been reduced to background noise in their busy American lives. I was a convenience when they needed me, a prop when they wanted to seem cultured, an obligation when tradition demanded it. But I was never seen as essential, never treated as the keeper of something precious that would die with me if they didn't start paying attention. I ended the recording and looked at it for a long moment. Then I saved it to my photos, right next to the pictures of my grandchildren's school events that I'd never been invited to, their achievements that I'd only heard about through Jessica's carefully curated social media posts. The irony wasn't lost on me. My granddaughter wanted to turn my pain into content, but she had no idea that I was documenting her callousness for posterity. Someday, when she was older, when she had children of her own, maybe she'd understand what she'd lost when she chose convenience over culture. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe this was just who they were now, and I was the fool for expecting anything different. I walked back toward the dining room, my phone tucked safely in my pocket. The recording was my insurance policy, my proof that I hadn't imagined the dismissal, hadn't overreacted to innocent comments. If anyone ever questioned my actions tonight, I'd have evidence of what had driven me to them. The clock on the mantel showed 11:52, 8 minutes until midnight, 8 minutes until the new year. And the new version of myself that I was about to unleash. I'd been patient for 20 years. I'd been understanding for 20 years. I'd been grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. But patience, I was learning, was not the same as wisdom. And sometimes, the most loving thing you could do for your family was to stop enabling their worst impulses, even if it meant breaking their hearts in the process. I excused myself from the celebration and walked upstairs to my bedroom, closing the door behind me with deliberate care. The sound of their voices drifted up from below, Jessica explaining something about quarterly projections, David agreeing with whatever she said, the kids making jokes I couldn't quite hear. They hadn't even noticed I'd left. My bedroom was my sanctuary, the one place in the house that remained truly mine. The walls were covered with photos from my real life, my wedding day, my children as babies, my husband's business achievements, my parents' immigration documents, not the carefully curated version Jessica preferred, but the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of a family built from nothing. I walked to my closet and moved aside the shoeboxes on the top shelf. Behind them was my safe, a small fireproof model my husband had insisted on buying after his first successful year in business. A woman should always have her own money, he'd said, and her own secrets. I'd thought he was being paranoid then. Now I understood he was being practical. The safe opened with a series of beeps, and I pulled out the manila folder that contained my financial documents. It had been 3 years since I'd looked at them carefully, 3 years since I'd paid attention to the numbers that had been growing quietly in the background of my life. The house deed came first, 1247 Maple Street, purchased in 1983 for $89,000 with a 20-year mortgage that we'd paid off in 12 years. Current estimated value, $1.2 million. Owned free and clear by Evelyn Chen, widow of Thomas Chen, with no co-signers, no joint ownership, no claims by anyone else. My family acted like I was living in their house, depending on their generosity, grateful for their occasional visits. The truth was exactly the opposite. The investment portfolio came next. My husband had been smarter than anyone gave him credit for, diversifying beyond his import business into real estate, index funds, and municipal bonds, conservative investments that grew steadily over decades. Current value, $2.8 million. Then the life insurance payout from Thomas's death, $500,000 that I'd barely touched, earning interest in a high-yield savings account. I'd been too greedy to spend it, too overwhelmed to know what to do with it. So it had just sat there, growing. The business sale documents were at the bottom of the pile. When Thomas died, I'd sold his import company to his business partner for $1.1 million, another amount I'd tucked away. Too emotional to make decisions about money when I was still learning how to live without him, I spread all the documents across my bedspread and stared at them. The total was staggering, $5.6 million. I was worth nearly $6 million, and my family treated me like a charity case. When had I stopped telling them about my financial situation? When had I started letting them believe I was struggling? I tried to remember, but the transition had been so gradual, so subtle. It started with small things. Jessica offering to pay for groceries when she visited. "Let me get this, Mom. I know things are tight on a fixed income." I'd protested at first, but she'd been so insistent, so certain that she was helping. Eventually it became easier to let her pay than to argue. Then came the bigger gestures. David handling my taxes because financial planning isn't something you should worry about at your age. Jessica taking over my doctor's appointments because you shouldn't have to navigate insurance alone. Michael offering to help with home repairs because you shouldn't be spending your savings on maintenance. Each offer had been presented as kindness, as children caring for their aging mother. But underneath each gesture was an assumption that I was helpless, that I was poor, that I needed their management more than their respect. I'd allowed it because it felt like love. After Thomas died, I'd been so hungry for any sign that my children cared about me that I'd accepted their pity as affection. I'd confused being managed with being cherished. But the truth was more complicated. They'd needed me to be helpless so they could feel important. They'd needed me to be poor so they could feel successful. They'd needed me to be diminished so they could feel elevated. My weakness had become their strength. My supposed dependence had become their validation. The irony was breathtaking. Jessica drove a leased BMW and lived in a rented condo, but she pitied me for my fixed income. David was leveraged to the hilt in his business ventures, but he worried about my financial security. Michael struggled with his mortgage payments, but he offered to help with my expenses. None of them had ever asked about my actual financial situation. They'd just assumed, and I'd let them assume, because their assumption gave them permission to feel superior while giving me scraps of their attention. I looked at the numbers again. $5.6 million. I could buy Jessica's condo outright and still have enough left over to pay for both grandchildren's college educations. I could support Michael through his business struggles without even noticing the dent in my portfolio. I could travel the world, buy a smaller house, hire help, do whatever I wanted. Instead, I'd spent 20 years pretending to be grateful for pizza. I gathered the documents and put them back in the safe, but I kept the house deed in my hand. This house, this beautiful home that had sheltered my family for 40 years, was mine. Every room, every memory, every tradition that had been built within these walls belonged to me. For 20 years, I'd acted like a guest in my own home. I'd cooked in my kitchen like I was asking permission. I'd cleaned and maintained and improved a property that I owned outright, while my family treated me like an elderly relative they were. Humoring. Tonight, that was going to change. I walked to my dresser and pulled out the small wooden box that held my wedding ring. Thomas's ring was there too, the simple gold band he'd worn for 37 years. I slipped both rings onto my fingers and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the helpless widow my family thought they were managing. She was a successful businesswoman, a property owner, a woman with resources and choices in power. She was also a woman who had spent 20 years being invisible in her own life, but not anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding Thomas's photograph in my hands. It was my favorite picture of him taken at Michael's college graduation. His face beaming with pride, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in front of the university's main building. He'd been so proud that day, not just of our son, but of what we'd built together. Thomas, I whispered to the photo, I think I've been doing this all wrong. His voice came back to me as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. It was something he'd said during his final weeks in the hospital, when the cancer had made him weak but his mind was still sharp. Evelyn, promise me you won't let them turn you into a ghost. You're the strongest woman I know. But you have this habit of making yourself smaller when people don't appreciate you. Don't do that after I'm gone. Don't disappear. I'd promised him I wouldn't, but I'd broken that promise almost immediately. Within months of his death, I'd started shrinking. I'd stopped talking about my accomplishments, stopped mentioning my financial security, stopped taking up space in conversations about the future. I'd become the quiet widow who cooked and cleaned, and was grateful for whatever attention she received. Thomas had built his business from nothing. Starting with a single shipment of porcelain from his cousin in Taiwan, he'd worked 8 days, learned English by watching television, navigated American business culture without a guide. When other Chinese immigrants told him to keep his head down and be grateful for whatever opportunities he was given, he'd ignored them. Respect isn't given, he'd told me countless times. It's earned and demanded. If you don't ask for it, you won't get it. I'd watched him demand respect from suppliers who tried to cheat him, from customers who thought they could intimidate him, from competitors who underestimated him. He'd never been aggressive, never been cruel, but he'd been absolutely clear about his worth and his expectations. Where had that woman gone? The one who'd stood beside him at business dinners, who'd negotiated with contractors, who'd managed the household finances and raised 2 children while working part-time at his company. When had I decided that being a widow meant being diminished? I remembered the exact moment. It was 6 months after Thomas died, at Michael's birthday dinner. I'd been telling a story about the early days of the business, about how we'd scraped together the money for that first shipment, about the night we'd sat at this very kitchen table, counting and recounting our savings. That's ancient history, Mom, Jessica had said, not unkindly. You don't need to worry about business anymore. That's Michael's and my job now. She'd meant it as comfort, as a way of telling me I could rest. But what I'd heard was dismissal. What I'd heard was that my experience, my knowledge, my contributions to the family's success were no longer relevant. But from that moment on, I'd started editing myself. I'd stopped telling stories about the business. I'd stopped mentioning my financial planning. I'd stopped offering advice about investments or property management or the dozen other things I'd learned during 30 years of marriage to an entrepreneur. I'd become the nice old Chinese lady who cooked traditional food and was grateful for visits. I'd erased myself so completely that even I had forgotten who I used to be. Thomas would be furious if he could see what I'd become. Not at them, at me, for choosing invisibility over influence, for trading respect for the illusion of being needed. "I'm sorry," I said to his photograph. "I'm sorry I became a ghost. I'm sorry I let them think I was helpless when you spent 30 years teaching me to be strong." I stood up and walked to my closet, pushing aside the comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes that had become my uniform. In the back, behind clothes I rarely wore anymore, hung the dress I'd worn to Jessica's law school graduation. Navy blue silk, tailored to fit, expensive enough to make a statement, the dress of a woman who knew her worth. I pulled it out and laid it on the bed. It still fit perfectly. I'd maintained the same weight for 20 years. One of the few things about myself that hadn't changed. As I changed clothes, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The navy dress transformed me, reminding me of the woman I'd been before grief and loneliness had convinced me to settle for less. This was the woman who'd helped build $1 million business. This was the woman who'd raised 2 successful children. This was the woman who'd navigated American culture without losing her Chinese identity. This was the woman who owned the house they were sitting in, who had enough money to buy and sell their assumptions about her, who had spent 20 years being patient with people who didn't deserve her patience. I checked the time on my phone. 11:56. 4 minutes until midnight. 4 minutes until I stopped being the woman who accepted crumbs and started being the woman who demanded the full meal. I walked to my jewelry box and pulled out the jade necklace Thomas had given me for our 25th anniversary. It was beautiful and valuable, but more than that, it was a symbol of everything we'd built together. When I wore it, I felt connected to the woman I'd been when he was alive, confident, capable, unashamed of her success. I fastened it around my neck and looked at myself one more time. The woman in the mirror was not the helpless widow downstairs. She was Evelyn Chen, businesswoman, property owner, matriarch of a family that had forgotten what she'd sacrificed to give them their opportunities. It was time to remind them. I walked to the door, paused with my hand on the handle, and made a silent promise to Thomas's memory. I would never disappear again. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, I would be seen, I would be heard, I would be respected, or I would be alone. But I would never again be invisible. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I'd been building for the past 3 years. It was labeled Family History, but it contained more than just nostalgic photos and immigration documents. It contained the truth about what my family had cost me, and what I'd given them in return. The first document was my immigration record from 1965. I had been 22 years old, fresh out of university in Taiwan, with a degree in business administration, and dreams of building something meaningful in America. I'd come on a student visa, worked my way through graduate school, and met Thomas in an economics class at NIU. Most people assumed I'd been a traditional immigrant wife, following my husband to America and depending on his success. The truth was more complicated. I'd arrived first. I'd been the one with the student visa, the one with the English skills, the one who'd navigated the immigration process and sponsored Thomas's visa when we decided to get married. I'd been the one who'd helped him start his business, using my business degree to handle the paperwork, the contracts, the financial planning. While he was learning American business culture, I was teaching him how to read profit and loss statements, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to manage cash flow during the lean months. The folder contained copies of all the documents that proved it: partnership agreements with my signature, business loan applications with my credit score, insurance policies with my name as co-owner. For the first 10 years of the company's existence, I'd been an equal partner in everything but title. But when the children came, I'd stepped back, not because Thomas asked me to, but because I'd wanted to. I'd wanted to be the mother. My own mother had never been able to be present, involved, available. I'd made the choice to focus on family while Thomas focused on business, and I'd never regretted it. What I'd regretted was how thoroughly that choice had been erased from the family narrative. In Jessica's version of the story, her father had been the brilliant entrepreneur who'd built everything from nothing. while her mother had been the supportive wife who'd stayed home with the children. It was a neat story, but it wasn't true. Next set of documents showed the real cost of my choices. When I'd stepped back from the business, I'd given up my equity stake, not because I had to, but because I'd wanted to simplify things, to avoid any appearance of conflict between my role as mother and my role as business partner. I'd signed over my shares to Thomas, accepting a promise that I'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time, a gesture of trust. A way of showing that I was more invested in our family than in profit margins. But the documents showed what that gesture had cost me. If I'd kept my equity stake, if I'd remained an official partner, my share of the business sale would have been $2.2 million instead of $1.1 million. I'd given up $1 million for the privilege of being seen as a traditional wife instead of a business partner. The irony was that I'd made the same choice my mother had made, and her mother before her. We'd all sacrificed our public recognition for our family's success, and we'd all been erased from the stories of that success. But unlike my mother and grandmother, I had documentation. I had proof of what I'd contributed, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd made possible. The immigration documents, the business records, the financial statements, they told the real story of how this family had built its wealth. Jessica's law degree had been paid for with money I'd earned. Michael's college education had been funded by a business I'd helped start. The house they were sitting in had been bought with profits from contracts I'd negotiated. The grandchildren's private school tuition came from investments I'd helped choose. Every success they'd celebrated, every opportunity they'd taken for granted, every assumption they'd made about their own superiority, all of it had been built on my invisible labor. I'd been the one who'd maintained the cultural connections that gave Thomas's import business its edge. I'd been the one who'd spoken Mandarin with suppliers, who'd understood the relationship-based business culture, who'd navigated the complexities of doing business across two cultures. I'd been the one who'd managed the household finances, who'd paid for their music lessons and summer camps and college applications. I'd been the one who'd researched neighborhoods and schools, who'd planned family vacations and managed social calendars. I'd been the one who'd preserved the family recipes, who'd maintained the traditions, who'd kept the culture alive for future generations, not because it was expected of me, but because I'd believed it was important. But in their version of the story, I was just the cook, the nice old lady who happened to know how to make dumplings. The final document in the folder was a letter I'd written but never sent. It was addressed to Jessica, and it had been sitting in my drafts folder for 2 years. Updated every time I felt particularly invisible, particularly taken for granted. I opened it now and read it again. Dear Jessica, am proud of your success, but I am hurt by your assumptions. You treat me like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. You have forgotten that I am not just your mother. I am also a woman who built a business, raised 2 children, and maintained a household while preserving a culture you've chosen to ignore. I have never asked you to be grateful for my sacrifices, but I have expected you to acknowledge them. I have never demanded credit for your achievements, but I have hoped you would remember what made them possible. I am not the helpless widow you think I am. I am the woman who chose to step back so you could step forward. But choosing to be invisible is not the same as being powerless, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. Your mother, I'd written it during one of my lonelier moments, when the weight of being unseen had felt unbearable, but I'd never sent it because I'd been afraid of disrupting the fragile peace we'd built, afraid of being seen as bitter or ungrateful. Tonight, I realized I'd been afraid of the wrong thing. I should have been afraid of disappearing completely, of letting them reduce me to nothing more than a convenient presence in their busy lives. I closed the laptop and stood up. The clock showed 11:58, 2 minutes until midnight, 2 minutes until I stopped being afraid of my own voice. I walked to the door, paused, and made a decision. I wouldn't send the letter. I wouldn't need to. I was going to deliver the message, in person, with the full weight of my 67 years, my invisible contributions, and my newfound understanding of my own worth. They thought they knew me. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening to the voices below. Jessica was explaining something about her latest case, her voice carrying the confident authority that had made her successful in law. David was making appreciative noises while scrolling through his phone. The kids were arguing about something trivial. Michael was cleaning up pizza boxes, probably feeling guilty about the confrontation earlier, all of them going through the motions of family togetherness. none of them noticing that the person who'd made this gathering possible was missing. How long would it take them to realize I'd been gone for 30 minutes? How long before they wondered where I was? I had my answer when I heard Jessica's voice rise above the others. "Where's Mom? We need to do the midnight countdown thing." The midnight countdown thing. 20 years of tradition reduced to a task on her mental checklist. Something to check off before they could all go home to their real lives. I pulled out my phone and set the timer for 2 minutes. I wanted to make my entrance at exactly midnight, when the symbolism would be perfect. A new year, a new version of myself. A clean break from the woman who'd spent 20 years being grateful for scraps. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye. The navy dress, the jade necklace, the determined set of my shoulders looked like the woman I'd been before grief had convinced me to settle for less. I looked like someone who owned things, who had built things, who deserved respect, but more than that, I looked like someone who was done waiting for respect to be given. I looked like someone who was ready to demand it. The timer on my phone showed 1 minute remaining. Downstairs, I could hear them calling for me. "Mom, come on, it's almost midnight. Where is she? Mom, should someone go check on her?" But none of them moved. None of them climbed the stairs to see if I was okay. They just called louder, as if volume would solve the problem of my absence. 30 seconds. I smoothed my dress, checked my necklace, and took a deep breath. In 30 seconds, I would walk down those stairs and change everything. There would be no going back to the woman who'd accepted dismissal as love, who'd confused being managed with being cherished. 20 seconds. I thought about Thomas, about the strength he'd always seen in me, about the promises I'd made to him and to myself. I thought about my mother and grandmother, about the sacrifices they'd made that had never been acknowledged, about the pattern of invisible women that ended with me. 10 seconds. I could hear them gathering in the living room, preparing for the countdown. Jessica's voice was getting impatient. "Where is she? We can't do this without her." They were right. They couldn't do this without me. They couldn't have their tradition, their family gathering, their sense of cultural authenticity without the woman who'd preserved it for them. But they'd forgotten that I was essential, not convenient. They'd forgotten that I was the foundation, not the decoration. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The timer went off, just as I heard them start the countdown from the living room. 10, 9, 8. I started down the stairs, timing my steps to match their voices. 7, 6, 5. My heels clicked against the hardwood, announcing my presence. 4, 3, 2. I reached the bottom step and walked into the living room, where they were all gathered around the television, watching the ball drop in Times Square. Happy New Year. They turned to include me in their celebration, expecting the same grateful smile I'd given them for 20 years. Instead, they found something else entirely. They found a woman who'd spent 30 minutes remembering who she was, what she'd built, and what she deserved. Jessica was the first to notice the change. Her eyes took in my dress, my necklace, the expression on my face, and her smile faltered. "Mom, are you okay? You look different." I finished for her. I look different because I am different, because as of midnight, I'm no longer the woman who accepts being treated like a convenience in her own home. The room went quiet. Even the kids looked up from their phones. Sensing that something significant was happening, I walked to the center of the room, positioning myself where they could all see me clearly, where they would have to look at me, really look at me, for the first time in years. "I have something to say," I announced, my voice carrying the authority that had been missing from it for too long. "And you're going to listen, all of you, without interruption, without explanations, without excuses." Michael set down the pizza box he'd been folding. David put away his phone. Jessica's mouth opened to speak, but I held up my hand. 20 years, I said, letting the words hang in the air. For 20 years, I have cooked elaborate meals that you've dismissed. I have preserved traditions that you've ignored. I have maintained a home that you've treated like a restaurant you can visit when convenient. I gestured toward the kitchen, where my feast still sat untouched. Tonight, I spent 20 hours preparing food that represents 4 generations of our family's history. And you replaced it with pizza because it was easier. Emma started to say something, but I turned to her with a look that stopped the words in her throat. "You called my heritage weird stuff. You wanted to photograph it for social media while eating processed food. You reduced 70 years of preserving culture to an aesthetic for your Instagram followers." I turned back to the group, my voice growing stronger with each word. But this isn't just about food. This is about respect. This is about acknowledgement. This is about the difference between being seen and being managed. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and I smiled. Perfect timing. Welcome to the new year, I said. And welcome to the new me. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. I watched their faces, processed what I'd said, saw the confusion, the discomfort, the slow realization that something fundamental had shifted. The family photo on the mantel, the one from last Christmas where we all looked happy and united, seemed to mock us with its false harmony. I walked over to it and turned it face down. For 20 years, I continued, my voice steady and clear, I have been the invisible woman in this family. I have cooked your meals, maintained your traditions, preserved your culture, and subsidized your lives. And in return, I have been treated like a convenient appliance that you can turn on when you need something and ignore when you don't. Jessica found her voice first, as I'd known she would. Mom, that's not fair. We don't treat you like what, Jessica? Like a servant, like someone whose contributions don't matter, like someone whose feelings are less important than your convenience. I pulled out my phone and showed her the video I'd recorded earlier. Would you like to see what you look like when you dismiss 20 hours of my work? Would you like to hear what your children said about my weird stuff while you were arranging pizza slices for your Instagram story? Her face went pale. You recorded us? I documented the truth, because I realized that when I'm gone, when there's no one left to remember how you really treated me, you'll tell yourselves that you were good children. You'll convince yourselves that you were grateful and respectful. But this video will remember what really happened. David shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn, I think you're overreacting. We've always appreciated, have you? I turned to him. This man who'd been calling me by my first name for 15 years without ever once asking if I preferred to be called Mrs. Chen, or Ma, or anything that acknowledged our relationship. Tell me, David, what did you appreciate about tonight's dinner? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't eaten a single bite of my food. He couldn't tell me what he'd appreciated because he'd been too busy with his phone to notice what I'd made. I thought so. I turned back to Jessica. Your husband has been in my home for 15 years, and he's never once asked me about my life, my history, my interests. To him, I'm just the Chinese mother-in-law who makes food for family gatherings. I'm not a person with my own story. Emma was staring at me with wide eyes. Grandma, you're scaring me. Good, I said, and meant it. You should be scared. You should be terrified that you're 17 years old and you know nothing about where you come from, who your people are, what they sacrificed to give you the life you have. You should be afraid that you're growing up thinking your heritage is just an aesthetic for social media. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a photo album, one of the thick ones with magnetic pages that held decades of memories. I opened it to a picture of my parents on their wedding day in Taiwan, 1943. This is your great-grandfather, Jake. He was a teacher who lost everything in the war. He sold his family's land to pay for passage to America, believing that his children would have better opportunities here. He died when you were 3, working in a restaurant kitchen at age 72 because he never learned enough English to do anything else. I turned the page to a photo of my mother in her nurse's uniform. This is your great-grandmother, Emma. She was a trained nurse in Taiwan, but her credentials didn't transfer to America. She spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses so that her daughter Me could go to college. She died speaking broken English because she was too tired after her 12-hour workdays to attend language classes. The room was completely silent now. Even the kids had put down their phones. And this, I said, showing them a photo of Thomas and me at the opening of his first warehouse, is your grandfather and me in 1978. We were building a business that would eventually employ 40 people and generate millions in revenue. I was his partner in everything: planning, financing, negotiating. But when you tell the story of this family's success, you forget that I was there. I closed the album and set it on the coffee table. You've forgotten that I wasn't just the woman who cooked dinner. I was the woman who helped build the foundation for everything you've achieved. I was the woman who sacrificed her career, her equity in the business, her public recognition, so that you could have opportunities your great-grandparents never dreamed of. Jessica's voice was smaller now, uncertain. Mom, we know you worked hard. We know you made sacrifices. But that was your choice. You chose to be a mother instead of a businesswoman. I chose to be both, I corrected. But I let you forget that I had ever been anything other than your mother. I let you reduce me to a single role because I thought it would make you feel more secure, more important. I was wrong. I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood I'd helped choose, the houses I'd watched fill with families over the decades. When we'd moved here, I'd been the young mother who knew all the neighbors, who organized block parties, who served on the school board. I'd been a presence in this community, a person with opinions and influence. When had I become the invisible, old woman who rarely left her house except for doctor's appointments and grocery shopping? I have been shrinking myself for 20 years, I said, still looking out the window, making myself smaller so you could feel bigger, pretending to be helpless so you could feel important, acting grateful for scraps so you could feel generous. I turned back to face them. But I'm not helpless. I'm not poor. I'm not dependent on your charity. I'm not the burden you've convinced yourselves you're managing so well. Michael was the first to speak. Ma, we don't think you're a burden, don't you? I asked. Then why do you handle my taxes without asking if I want your help? Why do you make my doctor's appointments without checking if I'm capable of making them myself? Why do you offer to pay for things without asking if I can afford them? He looked stricken. Because we want to help, because we care about you. Because you've decided I'm incapable of caring for myself, because you've convinced yourselves that I need your management more than I need your respect. I walked back to the center of the room, where they could all see me clearly. I have something to tell you, all of you, about who I really am, what I really have, and what I really deserve. The clock chimed 12:15. The new year was 15 minutes old, and I was just getting started. I walked to my purse and pulled out the bank statements I'd printed that afternoon. I'd been planning this moment for weeks, even if I hadn't fully admitted it to myself. The numbers were highlighted in yellow, impossible to ignore. Jessica, you drive a leased BMW and rent a 2-bedroom condo in Brooklyn. You make, what, $180,000 a year? Very respectable for a corporate lawyer. She nodded, confusion clear on her face. Yes, but what does that have to do with David? Your consulting firm has been struggling since the pandemic. You've been leveraging your business loans and borrowing against your life insurance to keep it afloat. Am I right? His face went white. How do you, Michael? Your mortgage is underwater, and you've been using credit cards to cover Emma's private school tuition. You borrowed $15,000 from your 401k last year to pay for Jake's summer camp. Michael's mouth fell open. Ma, how do you know all this? Because I've been paying attention. Because, while you've been assuming I'm too old and helpless to understand finances, I've been watching you struggle with money and wondering why you think I need your financial help. I spread the bank statements across the coffee table like a poker player revealing a royal flush. This is my checking account. Current balance, $47,000. This is my savings account. Current balance, $312,000. This is my investment portfolio. Current value, $2.8 million. The silence was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. This is the deed to this house. Paid off in 1995. Current estimated value, $1.2 million. This is the life insurance payout from your father's death. $500,000, barely touched. This is the documentation from the sale of your father's business. My share, $1.1 million. I picked up the papers and held them like a hand of cards. Total net worth, $5.6 million. I am worth nearly $6 million, and you treat me like a charity case. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Grandma, you're rich. I'm financially independent, I corrected. But more importantly, I'm financially independent while you're all struggling with debt and living paycheck to paycheck. I turned to Jessica. You offered to pay for my groceries last month. Do you know how much I spend on groceries? About $300 a month. Do you know how much I spend on everything else? About $2,000 a month. Do you know how much my investments earn me every month? About $15,000. Her face was cycling through emotions: shock, embarrassment, confusion. But you never said. I never said because you never asked. You assumed. You saw a 70-year-old Chinese woman living alone and decided she must be poor. You saw someone who didn't flaunt her wealth and assumed she didn't have any. I walked to David, who was still staring at the bank statements. You've been doing my taxes for 5 years. Have you ever actually looked at them? Yes, of course, I've looked at them. Have you? Or have you just filled in the forms and assumed I was living on Social Security and a small pension? He didn't answer, but his face told me everything I needed to know. Here's what you missed, I said. pulling out a tax return. Investment income, $180,000 last year. Rental income from the duplex I own in Queens, $36,000 annually. Interest income, $12,000. Social Security, $18,000. Total income, $246,000. I let that sink in. I made more money last year than Jessica did, and I didn't have to work for it. Michael found his voice. Ma, why didn't you tell us? Because you didn't want to know. Because it was easier for you to feel important if you thought I needed your help. Because you confused managing me with loving me. I sat down in my chair, the one they'd all learned to avoid. The one that had become my designated spot, like I was a piece of furniture. When your father died, you were both so eager to take care of me. Don't worry about the business, Mom. Let us handle the finances. Mom, you shouldn't have to think about these things. Mom, I looked directly at Jessica. Do you remember what you said to me at the funeral? You don't have to be strong anymore. Mom, we'll take care of everything now. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I was trying to help. I know, but what you were really saying was that you thought I was too weak to handle my own life. What you were really saying was that my 40 years of experience managing money and making decisions didn't matter anymore because I was now officially an old widow. I stood up and walked to the mantel, where photos of their achievements lined the shelf. Jessica's law school graduation, Michael's wedding, the kids' school pictures, a shrine to their success, built on the foundation of my invisibility. I have paid for Emma's violin lessons for 3 years. I have been putting money into Jake's college fund since he was born. I have been sending checks to cover Michael's property taxes every year since 2019. I have been paying for Jessica's health insurance because her firm switched to a high-deductible plan. I picked up Emma's latest school photo. I have been financially supporting this family for years, and you've been treating me like I'm the one who needs support. Emma was crying now. Grandma, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know. Because I wasn't supposed to be anything other than the nice old lady who cooked Chinese food and was grateful for attention. I wasn't supposed to be a person with resources, with power, with the ability to make choices about my own life. I turned back to Jessica. But here's what you really need to understand. I didn't tell you about my money because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had. I wanted you to visit because you enjoyed my company, not because you felt obligated to check on the poor old widow. I walked back to the bank statements and gathered them up. I have been subsidizing your lives while you've been pitying me. I have been the secret benefactor funding your children's opportunities while you've been treating me like a burden to be managed. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. The question now, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd just revealed her true power, is what we do with this information, because everything has changed. The woman you thought you knew doesn't exist. The helpless widow you've been managing doesn't exist. The grateful old lady who accepts whatever scraps you throw her way doesn't exist. I looked at each of them in turn. I am a wealthy woman who has been playing poor to make you feel important. I am a capable woman who has been playing helpless to make you feel needed. I am a powerful woman who has been playing powerless to make you feel superior. I smiled, and it wasn't the gentle, accommodating smile they were used to. But I'm done playing. As of tonight, you get to deal with the real me, and the real me has some very specific expectations about how she expects to be treated. I walked to the closet and pulled out a small rolling suitcase, the one I'd bought for a trip to Taiwan that I'd never taken because Jessica had convinced me I was too old to travel alone. I set it by the front door with deliberate care, making sure everyone could see it. This is my ultimatum, I said, my voice carrying the weight of 20 years of accumulated disappointment. Either you start treating me with the respect I deserve, or I will remove myself from your lives entirely. Jessica jumped up from the couch. Mom, you're being dramatic. You can't just, can't I interrupted. I'm a wealthy woman with no legal obligations to any of you. I can do whatever I want. I can go wherever I want. I can spend my money however I want. And I can choose who deserves to be in my life. I opened the suitcase to show them it was already packed. I have enough money to buy a condo in Florida tomorrow. I have enough money to hire a housekeeper, a cook, a companion. I have enough money to create an entirely new life surrounded by people who actually see me as a person instead of a convenience. Michael stood up, his face pale. Ma, you're scaring us. You don't mean this. I mean every word. For 20 years, I have been the one making all the effort in these relationships. I cook the meals, I host the gatherings, I maintain the traditions, I give the gifts, I send the cards, I make the phone calls. What do I get in return? I looked at each of them. Pizza dismissal, condescension, management instead of respect, pity instead of acknowledgement. Emma was crying harder now. Grandma, please don't leave. Then give me a reason to stay, I said, my voice softening slightly. Give me a reason to believe that any of you see me as more than just the old lady who happens to cook Chinese food. I walked to the kitchen and gestured to my untouched feast. This food represents 4 generations of women who preserved culture through recipes, who maintained traditions despite hardship, who kept family identity alive despite pressure to assimilate. When you dismiss it as weird stuff, you're not just dismissing food, you're dismissing me. You're dismissing your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, and everyone who came before them. I picked up one of my perfect dumplings, examining its careful pleats. Do you know why I fold these this way? Because my grandmother taught me that the number of pleats determines how much good fortune the dumpling will bring. 18 pleats for wealth, 24 for success, 36 for longevity. I made these with 24 pleats because I wanted success for this family. I set the dumpling down carefully. But success isn't just about money or careers. Success is about maintaining connections, preserving what matters, honoring what came before. Success is about being a family that actually sees each other, values each other, respects each other. I turned back to them. You want to know what my expectations are? They're simple. I expect to be consulted about decisions that affect me, not managed like a child. I expect my contributions to be acknowledged, not dismissed. I expect my heritage to be respected, not treated like an inconvenience. Jessica was wringing her hands. Mom, we can change. We can do better. Can you? I asked. Because this isn't just about tonight. This is about 20 years of patents. This is about fundamental assumptions you've made about who I am and what I deserve. I walked to David, who hadn't spoken in several minutes. You've been married to my daughter for 15 years. How many times have you asked me about my life in Taiwan? How many times have you asked me about my marriage, my business experience, my interests outside of cooking? He looked stricken. You never thought I was interesting enough to ask about. You never thought I had stories worth hearing. You never thought I was anything other than Jessica's mother, who happened to make good food. I turned to the teenagers. Emma, Jake, you're 17 and 14. You've been coming to this house for family gatherings your entire lives. Can either of you tell me one thing about your great-grandmother, besides the fact that she was Chinese? They looked at each other, then at their parents, then back at me. The silence was answer enough. She was a trained nurse who gave up her career to clean houses so her daughter could go to college. She spoke 3 languages and wrote poetry. She survived a war and built a new life in a country that didn't want her. She was brilliant and brave and complicated. But you don't know any of that because no one ever thought it was worth sharing. I walked back to the suitcase and zipped it closed. I have spent 20 years being the keeper of family history that no one wants to hear. I have spent 20 years preserving culture that no one values. I have spent 20 years being available for people who are too busy to be available for me. I looked at my watch. It's 12:30. The new year is 30 minutes old. I'm giving you until tomorrow night to decide whether you want to be part of my life on my terms, or whether you want to continue treating me like a convenience on your terms. Michael stepped forward. Ma, what do you want us to do? I want you to see me, I said simply. I want you to acknowledge what I've contributed to this family. I want you to respect the culture I've preserved. I want you to treat me like the matriarch I am, not like the burden you think I am. I picked up my purse and pulled out my car keys. I'm going to spend the night at the hotel downtown. I'm going to think about whether I want to continue investing my time, energy, and money in people who don't appreciate any of it. Jessica was crying now. Mom, please don't go. We can talk about this. We just did talk about this. For 30 minutes. I told you exactly how I feel and what I need. The question is whether you were listening, or whether you were just waiting for me to finish so you could convince me to go back to being invisible. I walked to the door and turned back one more time. I love you all. But love isn't enough anymore. Love without respect is just enabling. Love without acknowledgement is just manipulation. Love without reciprocity is just servitude. I opened the door and stepped into the cold January air. You have 24 hours to decide if you want to love me enough to actually see me. If not, I'll find people who will. I walked to my car, the luxury sedan I'd bought with my own money but had been parking in the garage, so they wouldn't ask questions about how I could afford it. Tonight, I didn't care what they thought about my car, my money, or my independence. I was done caring about their comfort at the expense of my dignity. As I drove away, I could see them standing in the doorway, watching me leave. For the first time in 20 years, they were the ones wondering if I would come back. The power dynamic had finally shifted, and it felt like freedom. I sat in my hotel room at 2 a.m., staring at my phone. 17 missed calls from Jessica, 12 from Michael, and a string of text messages that started with panic and moved through anger into bargaining. I read them all, but I didn't respond. They needed to sit with the discomfort of not knowing if I was coming back. The knock on my door at 2:30 a.m. didn't surprise me. I'd been expecting it. "Ma, I know you're in there." Michael's voice came through the door. "I can see your car in the parking lot." I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, still wearing the same clothes from dinner, his hair disheveled and his eyes red. He looked like he'd been crying. "How did you find me?" "I called every hotel in town until I found one that had an Evelyn Chen checked in." He looked exhausted. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside to let him enter. He looked around the room, the king-sized bed, the upscale furnishings, the view of the city skyline, and shook his head. "Even your hotel room is nicer than my apartment," he said, attempting humor but failing to hide his distress. I sat in the chair by the window and gestured for him to sit on the bed. "What do you want, Michael?" "I want to apologize. Really apologize. Not the fake apology I would have given you tomorrow to make you feel better, but a real one." He pulled out a letter from his jacket pocket. "I wrote this in the car. I needed to get my thoughts straight before I saw you." I recognized the handwriting, the same careful script he'd used for thank you notes as a child. "Read it to me." He unfolded the paper with shaking hands. "Dear Ma, I owe you an apology that's 20 years overdue. I've been complicit in making you invisible, and I'm ashamed of myself for it." His voice broke slightly, but he continued. "I've watched Jessica dismiss you, and I've said nothing. I've watched the kids treat your culture like an inconvenience, and I've said nothing. I've watched David ignore you, and I've said nothing. I've been the silent enabler of your invisibility." He looked up at me. I told myself I was being respectful, that I was staying out of family drama, but what I was really doing was choosing the path of least resistance. It was easier to let them treat you badly than to stand up for you. I remained silent, letting him continue. "I've been angry at Jessica for years. Angry at how she talks to you, how she manages you, how she treats you like an obligation instead of a person. But I never said anything because I didn't want to cause problems. I didn't want to be the one who disrupted the family dynamic." He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "But tonight, when you showed us those bank statements, when you told us about your money, I realized something. You didn't hide your wealth because you were ashamed of it. You hid it because you wanted to know if we would love you without it." Tears were streaming down his face now, "and we failed that test. We failed it completely." I felt something in my chest loosen. "Go on. I've been taking money from you for years. The property taxes, the help with the kids' expenses, the emergency loans when things got tight. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd pay you back when things got better. But I never did. I just kept taking." He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "And the whole time, I was treating you like you were the one who needed help, like you were the one who was struggling, like you were the one who should be grateful for our attention. Why didn't you ever ask me about my life?" I asked quietly. "About my experiences, my interests, my feelings." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was afraid of what you'd tell me. I was afraid you'd say you were lonely, that you were disappointed in how we'd turned out, that you regretted the sacrifices you'd made for us. So you decided it was easier to not ask at all." "Yes, and I was wrong. I was selfish and cowardly, and I'm sorry." I looked at this man, my son, my baby, the child I'd rocked to sleep and worried about through every stage of his life, and saw something I'd been missing. Behind his silence, behind his apparent indifference, was fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of disappointment, fear of being seen as inadequate. "Michael, do you remember when you were 12 and you tried to learn to make dumplings?" He nodded, a small smile breaking through his tears. "I was so proud of those lopsided little things. You remember what Jessica said about them?" His smile faded. she said. I was playing with food. She said it was a waste of time when I could be studying. And do you remember what you said? He shook his head. You said, I want to know how to make them so I can teach my kids someday. We're 12 years old, and you already understood that traditions die if no one passes them on. I leaned forward in my chair. What happened to that boy, Michael? What happened to the child who wanted to preserve something for the future? He was quiet for a long time. He got tired of being made fun of. He got tired of being called weird for caring about Chinese stuff. He got tired of being the only one who seemed to think it mattered. So you stopped trying. So I stopped trying. And I'm sorry for that too. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd spent most of my adult life. Michael, I'm not angry at you for stopping. I'm angry at myself for letting you stop alone. I turned back to him. When Jessica made fun of your dumplings, I should have defended you. When she dismissed your interest in our culture, I should have supported you. When she made you feel like caring about your heritage was childish, I should have shown you it was mature. Ma, no, let me finish. I failed you too. I let her dominate the family dynamic because it was easier than confronting her. I let her set the tone for how our culture was valued because I didn't want to seem like I was favoring one child over another. I sat back down. But in trying to be fair, I was actually being unfair to you. I was unfair to the child who wanted to learn, who wanted to preserve, who wanted to connect. Michael was crying again. So what do we do now? I looked at him looked at him and saw not just my son, but my ally. The one person in the family who might actually understand what I'd been trying to preserve. We start over, I said. We start with honesty about what we've both done wrong. We start with respect for each other as adults. We start with the understanding that love isn't enough if it's not backed up by actions. What actions? I smiled for the first time since I'd left the house. You're going to learn to make dumplings. The right way this time. And then you're going to teach your children. And when Jessica or anyone else makes fun of you for caring about your heritage, you're going to tell them that preserving culture is not childish, it's essential. He nodded. I'd like that. And I'm going to stop hiding who I am to make other people comfortable. I'm going to stop pretending to be helpless to make other people feel important. I'm going to stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the full meal, even if it means losing some people, especially if it means losing some people, because the people who can't handle the real me aren't worth keeping anyway. I reached out and took his hand. But you, Michael, you're worth keeping. You're worth fighting for. You're worth believing in. He squeezed my hand. So are you, Ma. So are you. Jessica arrived at the hotel at 8 a.m. sharp, looking like she'd been up all night. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smudged, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked, for the first time in years, vulnerable. Michael had stayed until 4 a.m., talking through 20 years of family dynamics, sharing memories I'd forgotten he'd kept, asking questions I'd never expected him to ask. When he finally left, we'd both cried not from sadness, but from relief. Relief that we'd finally seen each other clearly. Jessica knocked on my door with the same authoritative rhythm she used for everything else. But when I opened it, she didn't stride in with her usual confidence. She stood in the doorway, uncertain. Mom, we need to talk. Yes, we do. I stepped aside to let her enter. But first, you need to understand something. I'm not the same woman you left last night. I'm not going to be managed, convinced, or manipulated back into being invisible. If you're here to fix me, you can leave now. She flinched at the word fix, but she came in anyway. She looked around the hotel room the same way Michael had, taking in the expensive furnishings, the obvious comfort, the evidence that I was capable of taking care of myself. I brought you something, she said, pulling out her expensive purse, the one I'd secretly paid for 2 years ago. From it, she withdrew a small, worn book. It was my immigration journal, the one I'd kept during my first year in America. I'd written in it every day, documenting my experiences, my struggles, my hopes. I'd forgotten she'd even seen it. I found this in your recipe box years ago, she said, setting it on the table between us. I read it. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have, but I was curious about your life before us. I picked up the journal, running my fingers over the faded cover. When did you read it? When I was in law school. I was struggling with a particularly difficult class, feeling sorry for myself, and I found this. I read about how you came to America alone, how you worked 3 jobs while going to graduate school, how you learned English by watching soap operas and reading newspapers in the library. She sat down on the bed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I read about how you met Dad, how you helped him start his business, how you gave up your own career plans to focus on family. I read about how you felt invisible sometimes, how you worried that your sacrifices weren't appreciated. I opened the journal to a random page. My young handwriting stared back at me, full of determination and hope. If you read it, then you knew how I felt. You knew I was capable of more than cooking and cleaning. I knew, she whispered. And I'm ashamed of how I treated you anyway. Why? I asked. Why did you treat me like a burden when you knew I was capable of so much more? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, because it was easier. Because if I acknowledged how strong you were, I'd have to acknowledge how weak I was. Because if I admitted you were capable of managing your own life, I'd have to face the fact that I was controlling you to make myself feel important. I closed the journal and set it aside. Go on. I've been jealous of you my entire life, she said, the words tumbling out like a confession. You came to America with nothing and built something. You learned a new language, adapted to a new culture, helped start a successful business. You did all of that while maintaining your identity, your values, your sense of self. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I was born here. I had every advantage you didn't have. I spoke English natively. I understood the culture. I had opportunities handed to me that you had to fight for. And yet I've spent my whole life feeling like I was never quite American enough for my colleagues and never quite Chinese enough for you. I felt a stab of recognition. You felt caught between two worlds. Yes, and instead of asking you to help me navigate that, instead of learning from your experience, I decided it was easier to reject the Chinese part entirely. I convinced myself that your culture was old-fashioned, that your traditions were inconvenient, that your way of doing things was outdated. She pulled out her phone and showed me her Instagram account. Look at this. I post about diversity and inclusion at work. I talk about the importance of cultural heritage. I use my Asian identity when it's professionally advantageous. But I've never actually lived it. I've never actually honored it. I scrolled through her posts. She was right, there were photos of her at Asian American lawyer events, posts about Asian Heritage Month, quotes about honoring your ancestors, but there were no photos of family gatherings, no mentions of traditional foods, no acknowledgement of the actual Asian woman who'd raised her. I've been performing my heritage for strangers while rejecting it in my actual life, she continued. I've been using my identity as a brand while ignoring the person who preserved it for me. Why? I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. Because it was easier to love the idea of being Chinese American than to actually be Chinese American. Being Chinese American meant listening to stories about hardship I didn't experience. It meant learning a language I didn't need. It meant eating food my friends thought was weird. It meant having a mother who embarrassed me sometimes by being too traditional, too foreign, too much. The honesty in her voice was painful to hear. I embarrassed you. Not you, she said quickly. The parts of you that reminded me of what I was trying to escape. Your accent when you got tired. Your insistence on certain traditions. Your way of showing love through food instead of words. She wiped her eyes. I wanted a mother who fit into my American life seamlessly. I wanted a mother who spoke perfect English, who understood my career pressures, who would brag about me to other American mothers in ways they could understand. Instead, you've got a mother who hand-folded dumplings and talked about ancestors you'd never met. Instead, I got a mother who was more interesting, more accomplished, and more resilient than any of my friends' mothers. But I was too immature to see it. I sat down across from her. Jessica, when did you start seeing me as a project to be managed instead of a person to be known? She thought for a moment. When Dad died, you were so lost, so grief-stricken. I thought you needed me to take care of you, but the truth is, I needed to take care of you. I needed to feel useful, needed, important, and I let you, because I was lonely and it felt like love. It was love, she said, but it was also control. I was so afraid of losing you that I convinced myself you couldn't survive without me. I was so afraid of being abandoned that I made you dependent on me. Except I was never dependent on you. No, you were financially independent, emotionally strong, and perfectly capable of living your own life. But I couldn't handle that, so I created a version of you that needed me. I infantilized you so I could feel important. I looked at this woman, my daughter, my firstborn, The child I'd been most proud of and most worried about him saw something I'd been missing. Behind her success, behind her confidence, behind her need to control everything, was a scared little girl who'd never learned how to be vulnerable. Jessica, why didn't you ever ask me about my life, about my experiences, my feelings, my dreams? Because I was afraid of what you'd tell me. I was afraid you'd say you were disappointed in me, that you regretted the sacrifices you'd made, that you wished you'd had different children. So you decided it was safer to not know. Yes. And I convinced myself that managing your practical needs was the same as caring about your emotional needs. I convinced myself that helping with your doctor's appointments was the same as asking how you were feeling. She pulled out her phone again and showed me her contacts. I have your doctor's number, your insurance information, your pharmacy, but I don't have the names of your friends, your interests, your favorite places to go. I know your medical history, but I don't know your dreams. I looked at her phone, at the evidence of how she'd reduced me to a series of appointments and obligations. What do you want to know? Everything, she said. And for the first time in years, she sounded like my little girl again. I want to know what you think about when you're alone. I want to know what you miss about Taiwan. I want to know what you're proud of besides us. I want to know what you want to do with the rest of your life. Those are big questions. I have time. We have time. If you'll give me another chance. I looked at her and saw not just the successful lawyer who'd been managing my life, but the frightened child who'd been trying to earn my love through achievements instead of asking for it directly. Jessica, I need you to understand something. I'm not going back to being the woman who accepts being managed. I'm not going back to being grateful for scraps. I'm not going back to being invisible. I don't want you to go back. I want you to move forward with me, if you'll let me. What does that look like? I don't know yet, but I want to learn. I want to learn to make dumplings. I want to learn about your parents, your childhood, your dreams. I want to learn how to be your daughter instead of your manager. I picked up the immigration journal and held it out to her. Then start here. Read it again, but this time, don't read it to understand how hard my life was. Read it to understand how strong I was. Read it to understand who I am, not just what I survived. She took the journal with shaking hands. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for making you invisible. I'm sorry for treating you like a burden instead of a blessing. I'm sorry for taking 20 years to see you. I'm sorry too, I said. I'm sorry for letting you think I was helpless. I'm sorry for enabling your need to control me. I'm sorry for choosing invisibility over honesty. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 20 years of misunderstanding settling between us. So what now? She asked. I stood up and gathered my things. Now we start over. We start with respect, with honesty, with the understanding that love isn't enough if it doesn't come with acknowledgement. Does that mean you're coming home? It means I'm willing to try. But Jessica, understand this, I'm not coming back to the same dynamic. I'm not coming back to being the invisible woman who's grateful for pizza. I'm coming back as the matriarch of this family, with all the respect and authority that position deserves. She nodded. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about changing how you treat me. This is about changing how you see me. This is about accepting that I'm not just your mother. I'm also a woman with her own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and power. I want to see you. I want to really see you. I looked at her one more time, searching for sincerity behind the tears. What I found was something I'd almost stopped believing in: hope. Then let's go home, I said. Let's go start over. When we walked back into the house together, Emma and Jake were sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched feast like it was a museum exhibit they'd never really seen before. They looked up when we entered, their faces showing a mixture of shame and curiosity. Grandma, Emma said quietly, we threw away the pizza. We didn't know if we should touch your food, but we didn't want to leave the pizza out either. It was a small gesture, but significant. They'd removed the symbol of their dismissal and left my food in its place of honor. Thank you, I said, sitting down at the table. That was thoughtful. Jake shifted in his seat. Grandma, can you tell us about the dumplings? Like why you make them that way? I looked at this 14-year-old boy who'd called my heritage weird stuff just hours earlier, and saw something new in his eyes. Not polite interest, not teenage obligation, but genuine curiosity. The pleats, I said, picking up one of the dumplings. Each fold represents a wish for the person who will eat it. This one has 24 pleats, one for each year of success. I hoped you would have Emma leaned forward. You made wishes for each of us. I made wishes for the whole family. That's what food is, in our culture. It's not just nutrition, it's intention. It's love made visible. It's hope given form. I walked to my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the video I'd recorded earlier. But last night, I also recorded what happened to those wishes. Would you like to see it? They nodded, though they looked nervous. I played the video, their dismissive comments, their casual rejection of my work, their reduction of my heritage to social media content. Watching their faces change as they heard their own voices was painful but necessary. Oh my God, Emma whispered. We sound so horrible. You sound like teenagers who've never been taught to value what they have, I corrected. But that's my fault as much as yours. I let you grow up thinking your heritage was optional, that culture was just an aesthetic choice. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Grandma, are you really rich? I'm financially comfortable, but more importantly, I'm rich in experiences, in knowledge, in stories that will die with me if I don't pass them on. What kind of stories? I sat down between them, something I hadn't done in years. Stories about your great-great-grandmother, who hid jewelry in her shoes when she fled the war. Stories about your great-grandfather, who learned to read by trading vegetables for lessons. Stories about your grandmother, who came to America with nothing but determination and built a life that gave you opportunities. Emma put down her phenox, put it down, screen side down, giving me her full attention. Tell us. Your great-great-grandmother was a revolutionary, not the kind with guns and manifestos, but the kind who refused to bind her daughter's feet, even when everyone said she was ruining her marriage prospects. She believed that women should be able to walk freely in the world. I picked up another dumpling, this one with 18 pleats. She taught her daughter, your great-grandmother, to be a nurse. Not because it was respectable, but because it was independent, because it was a skill that could travel anywhere, that could support a family, that could save lives. And she came to America. Jake asked. She came to America and spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses so that her daughter Me could go to college. She spoke 3 languages fluently, but she pretended to understand less English than she did because it made her employers more comfortable. Emma's eyes were wide. She pretended to be less smart than she was. She pretended to be less threatening than she was. Just like I've been doing with this family for 20 years. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Your great-grandmother died speaking broken English in public and perfect English at home. She died knowing that her granddaughter was ashamed of her accent, her traditions, her way of showing love. Emma started crying. Grandma, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, because no one taught you. Because I was so busy trying to fit into your American lives that I forgot to teach you about your Chinese soul. I stood up and walked to the stove, where my feast was still waiting. This food represents 4 generations of women who preserved culture through recipes, women who maintained identity through tradition, women who showed love through nourishment. I began serving the food onto plates, the aromas filling the kitchen. Your great-great-grandmother's courage, your great-grandmother's sacrifice, your grandmother's resilience, and your mother's struggle to balance 2 worlds. What about us? Jake asked. What do we represent? I looked at him. This boy who was just beginning to understand the weight of his inheritance. You represent choice. You can choose to be the generation that breaks the chain, that lets the culture die with me, or you can choose to be the generation that carries it forward. Emma picked up a dumpling and examined its pleats. How do we carry it forward? By learning, by listening, by asking questions, by understanding that you're not just American teenagers, you're Chinese American teenagers with a history that goes back thousands of years. I sat back down at the table. By eating this food and tasting the love that went into it, by learning to make it yourselves, by teaching it to your children someday. Jake bit into his dumpling, chewing thoughtfully. It's actually really good. It's actually really good, I agreed. It's complex, it's layered, it's made with techniques that took generations to perfect. Just like you. Emma was crying again. But this time they seemed like different tears. Grandma, I want to learn. I want to know the stories. I want to understand where I come from. I want to learn too, Jake said. I want to know about our family. I want to know about you. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd carried for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Then we'll start tomorrow. We'll start with the stories. We'll start with the recipes. We'll start with the understanding that culture isn't a costume you put on when it's convenient. It's a foundation you build your life on. Will you teach us to make dumplings? Emma asked. I'll teach you to make dumplings. But more than that, I'll teach you to make them with intention. I'll teach you to fold wishes into the pleats. I'll teach you to understand that every meal is an opportunity to show love, to preserve tradition, to honor the people who came before you. And if we mess up? Jake asked. I smiled, the first genuinely happy smile I'd felt in months. Then we'll start over. We'll keep practicing until you get it right. We'll keep trying until you understand that perfection isn't the goal, connection is. I looked at these two young people, my grandchildren, and saw something I'd almost given up on seeing: the future of my family's culture, not as tourists or performers, but as inheritors, as the next generation of keepers. But understand this, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd just reclaimed her power. This isn't just about learning to cook. This is about learning to be proud of who you are. This is about learning to value what you've inherited. This is about learning to carry forward what matters. They nodded, and for the first time in 20 years, I believed they meant it. Now, I said, standing up to serve more food, let's eat. Let's taste what 4 generations of love looks like. Let's begin. 3 weeks later, I sat in my lawyer's office, finalizing the document that would change everything. It wasn't a will, it was a family contract, a set of expectations and boundaries that would govern how we treated each other going forward. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Chen? My lawyer asked, reviewing the pages. These are quite specific terms. I'm absolutely sure, I said. I've spent 20 years letting people take my contributions for granted. I'm not doing that anymore. The contract was simple but comprehensive. It outlined my expectations for respect, acknowledgement, and reciprocity. It established consequences for dismissive behavior. It created a framework for family relationships based on mutual appreciation rather than one-sided giving. Most importantly, it formalized my role as the family matriarch with all the authority and respect that position deserved. I'd spent the 3 weeks since New Year's Eve establishing my new boundaries. I'd stopped automatically saying yes to requests for help. I'd started charging interest on loans. I'd begun requiring advance notice for visits. I'd made it clear that my time, my energy, and my resources were no longer unlimited. The response had been mixed. Jessica had thrown herself into learning about my life with the same intensity she brought to her legal cases. She'd read my immigration journal 3 times, asked hundreds of questions about my childhood, my marriage, my dreams. She'd even started taking Mandarin lessons, claiming she wanted to be able to communicate with me in my native language. Michael had been coming over twice a week for dumpling lessons. He was a slow learner, but a dedicated one. His dumplings were still lopsided, but they were made with genuine care. More importantly, he'd started standing up to Jessica when she tried to manage me, creating a balance in family dynamics that had been missing for years. The grandchildren had surprised me most. Emma had started a family history project for school, interviewing me about my experiences as an immigrant. She'd even learned to make my grandmother's congee recipe, though she added her own modern twist with toppings I'd never considered. Jake had become my unofficial cultural liaison, helping me understand American teenage culture while learning about his Chinese heritage. He'd started using chopsticks at every meal, claiming it was more authentic than forks. But David had been the most resistant to change. He'd attended exactly 1 family dinner since New Year's, spending most of it on his phone, treating the new dynamic like a phase that would pass if he ignored it long enough. That was about to change. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see Jessica approaching with a manila envelope in her hands. "Mom," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I have something for you." She handed me the envelope. Inside were legal documents, incorporation papers, business licenses, official forms. "What is this?" "It's a business proposal. I want to start a company with you. Chen and Associates, Cultural Preservation Services. We'd help other families document their immigration stories, preserve their recipes, maintain their traditions." I stared at the papers. "You want to work with me? I want to work for you. You'd be the president, the primary consultant, the face of the company. I'd handle the legal aspects, the business development, the marketing. We'd be partners, but you'd be the senior partner." I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd spent 20 years trying to manage my life, now offering to work under my direction. Why? Because I realized something. I've been trying to prove myself by distancing myself from you, by showing that I could succeed despite my heritage, instead of because of it. But you've been successful all along. You've preserved culture, raised successful children, maintained family traditions, built wealth. You've done everything I've been trying to do, but you've done it with grace. She pulled out her phone and showed me a draft website. I've been working on this for 2 weeks. Look at the mission statement. I read, Chen and Associates helps families preserve their cultural heritage through documented storytelling, traditional recipe collection, and intergenerational knowledge transfer. Founded by Evelyn Chen, immigrant, businesswoman, and master of 4 generations of Chinese culinary tradition. You want to make me the face of a business. I want to make you the face of our family's business. I want to stop hiding our heritage and start celebrating it. I want to stop being ashamed of having a Chinese mother and start being proud of learning from a Chinese master. I looked at the incorporation papers again. This is a real business proposal. This is my apology. This is my acknowledgement. This is my way of saying that I want to spend the rest of my life making up for 20 years of not seeing you. I set the papers down and looked at her carefully. Jessica, I appreciate this, but I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for grand gestures. I'm looking for consistent respect. I'm looking for daily acknowledgement. I'm looking for the small things that show you see me as a person, not just as your mother. I understand. But I also want to do more than just treat you better. I want to build something with you. I want to create something that honors what you've preserved, that shares what you know, that makes your knowledge available to other families. She leaned forward. Mom, you're not just a keeper of culture. You're a master of it. You're an expert in something that's disappearing. You're a resource that other families need, and I want to help you share that with the world. I picked up the papers again, reading through the business plan more carefully. It was thorough, professional, and surprisingly respectful of my expertise. What would my role be, exactly? You'd be the primary consultant. You'd work with families to document their stories, collect their recipes, help them create preservation plans. You'd teach cooking classes, lead cultural workshops, maybe even write a cookbook. And your role, I'd handle the business side, legal structure, client contracts, marketing, administration. I'd be your business partner, but you'd be the boss. I thought about this for a long moment. Jessica, are you doing this because you feel guilty, or because you genuinely believe in it? Both, she said honestly. I feel guilty about how I've treated you, and I want to make amends. But I also believe in this. I believe in what you have to offer. I believe in the value of cultural preservation. I believe in you. I looked at the contract my lawyer had prepared, then at the business proposal Jessica had created, 2 different documents, but both representing the same thing, a formal recognition of my worth, my expertise, my authority. I'll consider it, I said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, this isn't charity. This isn't your way of giving me something to do in my retirement. This is a real business with real expectations and real consequences. Agreed. Second, I retain final authority over all cultural content. I decide what stories get told, what recipes get shared, what traditions get preserved. You don't edit my expertise. Agreed. Third, if this becomes another way for you to manage me, if you start treating me like the nice old lady who needs your help, instead of the expert who's teaching you, the partnership ends. Agreed. I picked up a pen and signed the contract my lawyer had prepared. Then, let's try it. Let's see if we can build something together as equals instead of as manager and managed. Jessica signed as well, and for the first time in 20 years, we were officially partners instead of just mother and daughter. So what now? She asked. Now we start with the most important client, I said. Our own family. We start by making sure Emma and Jake understand their heritage. We start by teaching them the stories, the recipes, the traditions. We start by proving that this matters, that it works, that it's worth preserving, and if we succeed, then we help other families do the same. We help other grandmothers stop being invisible. We help other cultures survive in America. We help other families remember that their heritage is a gift, not a burden. I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd spent 20 years treating me like a project and was now offering to treat me like a partner. Welcome to the family business, Jessica. The real family business. 1 year later, I stood in my kitchen on New Year's Eve, watching 3 generations of my family work together to prepare our feast. The scene was dramatically different from the previous year, but the transformation went deeper than just the shared labor. Emma stood at the counter, her sleeves rolled up, carefully pleating dumplings under my watchful eye. Her technique had improved dramatically over the past year, but more importantly, her understanding had deepened. She no longer saw the dumplings as just food, she saw them as carriers of intention, vessels of love. 18 pleats for this one, Grandma, she asked, holding up a dumpling for my inspection. 24, I corrected. This batch is for success in the new year. Right, success, not just wealth. She'd learned the difference between the two, learned that the number of pleats carried meaning beyond superstition. Jake was at the stove, stirring the soup with the same focused concentration he brought to his video games. He'd surprised everyone by developing a natural talent for cooking, an intuitive understanding of flavors that reminded me of my grandmother. How do I know when it's ready? He asked, tasting the broth. When it tastes like home, I said, the same answer my mother had given me. Michael was teaching his children the proper way to fold wontons, his own technique still imperfect but improving with each attempt. His marriage to Amy had strengthened over the past year, partly because she'd embraced the cultural education with enthusiasm, partly because he'd found his voice in family discussions. Remember, he was telling Jake, the fold has to be tight enough to hold the filling, but not so tight that it bursts when we cook it. Jessica was documenting everything, but not for social media this time. She was creating a family cookbook, complete with stories, photographs, and detailed instructions. Our business, Chen and Associates, had taken off beyond our wildest expectations. And she'd become as passionate about cultural preservation as she'd once been about corporate law. Mom, tell me again about the significance of the fish, she said, photographing the whole steamed fish that was the centerpiece of our meal. The fish represents abundance and prosperity, I explained. But it has to be served whole, with the head and tail intact, to ensure that prosperity lasts from beginning to end. And we serve it last. We serve it last because it represents the completion of the meal, the fulfillment of all the wishes we've made throughout the evening. David was notably absent. He'd been invited, but had chosen to spend the evening with his business associates. Jessica had stopped making excuses for him months ago, and I'd stopped pretending his absence didn't matter. Some people, I'd learned, were simply unwilling to change, and I no longer had the energy to accommodate their resistance. The most dramatic change was in myself. I wore the beautiful red silk dress that Jessica had bought from Manat as a charity gesture, but as a business partner in acknowledging my professional success. The new apron Emma had embroidered for me was tied over it, featuring traditional Chinese flowers and the words Master Chen in both English and Chinese characters. I was no longer the invisible woman cooking in solitude. I was the acknowledged matriarch, the cultural expert, the family business owner teaching her craft to willing students. Grandma, Emma said, holding up a perfectly pleated dumpling, I think I'm getting it. You're getting it, I agreed, but I was talking about more than just the dumpling technique. Over the past year, she'd embraced her heritage with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a treasure. She'd learned basic Mandarin, researched our family history, and even started a cultural club at her school. Tell me again about great-great-grandmother's feet, she said, settling into the story the way she used to settle into bedtime fairy tales. She refused to bind her daughter's feet, even though everyone told her it would make marriage impossible. I began, the story as familiar as breathing. She said women should be able to walk freely in the world, should be able to chase their dreams on their own 2 feet. And great-grandmother became a nurse, Jake added, showing he'd been listening, even while stirring. She became a nurse, and she came to America, and she made sure her daughter Me could go to college. And you helped Grandpa build his business, Emma continued. And I helped your grandfather build his business, and I raised 2 children, and I preserved the culture that connects us all. And now you're teaching us, Jake said. And now I'm teaching you, so you can teach your children someday. It was a ritual we'd developed over the past year. This recitation of our family history, not as a burden to be carried, but as a gift to be shared. Not as old-fashioned stories that had no relevance to modern life, but as living wisdom that informed our present choices. The clock on the wall showed 11:30. In 30 minutes, it would be midnight, and we'd celebrate not just the new year, but the transformation of our family. Are we ready? I asked, looking around at the feast we'd prepared together. We're ready, Michael said, and I could hear the pride in his voice, not just pride in the food, but pride in the process, in the collaboration, in the way we'd learned to work together. As a family, we carried the dishes to the dining room, where the table was set with my good china, my wedding crystal, my grandmother's silver chopsticks, not for show, but for use, not because we were trying to impress anyone, but because we were honoring the moment. As we sat down together, I looked around the table at faces that had learned to see me, to value me, to treat me as the expert I'd always been. The contrast with the previous year was stark. Instead of pizza boxes and dismissive comments, we had a feast prepared with love and eaten with appreciation. Before we begin, I said, raising my glass of plum wine, I want to say something. They all looked at me, their attention complete and genuine. Last year, I was the invisible woman in this family. I was the one who cooked and cleaned and preserved culture while being treated like a convenience. I was the one who gave and gave and gave while receiving only scraps of attention in return. I paused, looking at each of them. This year, I am the acknowledged matriarch. I am the business owner, the cultural expert, the family historian. I am the woman who demanded respect and received it. I am the woman who stopped accepting crumbs and started expecting the full meal. And we're better for it, Jessica said. We're better people, a better family, because you stopped letting us take you for granted. We're more connected, Michael added. We know more about ourselves, about where we come from, about what we want to pass on. We're prouder, Emma said. We're proud of being Chinese American instead of embarrassed by it. We're smarter, Jake said. We know things now that we didn't know before. Important things. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were different tears than the ones I'd cried the previous year. These were tears of fulfillment, of satisfaction, of a job well done. What I learned this year, I said, is that love without respect is just enabling. Care without acknowledgement is just management. Family without reciprocity is just obligation. I raised my glass higher. But when love includes respect, when care includes acknowledgement, when family includes reciprocity, then you have something worth preserving. Then you have something worth passing on. To family, Jessica said, raising her glass. To respect, Michael added. To heritage, Emma said. To the future, Jake said. To the truth, I finished. To the understanding that we are all valuable, all worth seeing, all deserving of the full meal instead of just the crumbs. We drank, and then we began to eat. The food was delicious, but more than that, it was meaningful. Each dish carried history, intention, love. Each bite connected us to our ancestors, to our culture, to each other. As midnight approached, I looked around. The table at my family really looked at them, the way they'd learned to really look at me. What I saw was not perfection, but progress. Not the end of our journey, but a new beginning. The clock struck 12, and we raised our glasses again. Happy New Year, we said together, but what we really meant was, Happy New Us. Happy new understanding, happy new way of being family. The woman who had served truth instead of accepting dismissal had gotten exactly what she'd demanded: respect, acknowledgement, and love that was backed up by action. It had taken 67 years, but I was finally visible in my own life, and it was everything I'd dreamed it would be.